Our friend Dr. Jim Delisle passed away recently, and we're re-releasing this conversation in his memory. Jim was a prolific author, a fierce advocate for gifted kids, and someone I was honored to call a friend. He also wrote the foreword for my first book, and his words and wisdom continue to shape the way so many of us understand gifted education today. We recorded this early in the life of the podcast, back when I was still finding my rhythm as an interviewer, but Jim made it easy. I hope you'll hear his warmth, humor, and deep care for gifted kids throughout our conversation.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Today, we welcome Dr. Jim Delisle. He was a professor of education at Kent State University in Ohio for 25 years. And while he was there, he was selected by the faculty and students as a distinguished professor, which is the university's most prestigious teaching award. Dr. Delisle has written many books on the subject of giftedness. His most recent book is Doing Poorly on Purpose: Strategies to Reverse Underachievement and Respect Student Dignity. Jim, thanks for being here.
Sure.
The subtitle of your book addresses the concept of dignity within that framework of reversing underachievement. So what experiences brought you to feel like you really needed to address dignity within this topic of reversing underachievement?
Sure. Let me begin with how I got into this whole field in the first place. I think that'll be instructive for this. I had been a special ed teacher in northern New Hampshire from my beginning of my career. My 2 degrees prior to my doctorate were in special ed for kids with disabilities. Well, it was my first couple of years of teaching, and I had this kid in my class who was a 5th grader, and as my mother would say, he hated me like the devil hates holy water. I mean, this kid just could not stand coming to my classroom. And I would give him a folder of work. He didn't want to work with the other kids because he thought he was smarter than they were, and I later found out, in fact, he was. I would give him a folder of work in the morning, and anything that was either logic-based or creative or dealt with some of his interests in hunting and space, whatever. He would do the work and he'd put it back in his folder and it'd be accurate. Anything he didn't like, he would write the word irrelevant in a red crayon across the paper. And he spelled irrelevant correctly, which said to me, this, what's going on? And then he would ball it up and throw it at me. And this happened every day. And so I'm thinking, all right, they taught me about how to deal with this kid in college. They told me to ignore the behavior. That didn't work. They told me to reinforce positive behavior. That didn't work. They told me to punish him when he did it. Anything they told me in college didn't work. And I was totally frustrated as a first-year teacher. So I basically let Matt just sit there and do the work that he wanted and then sleep the rest of the time. I felt terrible. I felt frustrated. But I honestly, my bag of tricks was empty. And then in the second year I taught him, this was not a short-term thing. In the second year, he came into school one day in March and he had just been sprayed by a skunk. And he loved coming to school that day. He smelled to high heaven. And he came in my class with this grin on his face. And I was like, okay, outside, we're going to talk. And that's what changed my life and my career. And in a sense, what caused me to write this book. Because what happened was this. Matt had been in his backyard that morning checking on his business, which was maple sugar farming. So he had tapped all of the sugar maples in his backyard. He had written contracts with the property owners near his, around his neighbors. And so he gave them back a portion, he didn't use that word, a proportion of the syrup that he made from the sap he collected. And he and his dad had built a stove in their backyard because he takes 40 gallons of sap or 1 gallon of syrup, on and on and on. He's telling me about this business. And March is also when skunks come out to mate. So Matt got between 2 amorous skunks. They didn't like him being there. They got sprayed. Then he came to school. So from that day on, what I said was, Matt, everything else I've tried didn't work. I'm going to make maple sugar your curriculum for the rest of the year. And almost overnight, those irrelevant red bombs stopped coming to my desk. And Matt started doing even some of the work that he didn't like, because all of a sudden I looked at him and said, how can I help you? What do you need to know? And how can I be your conduit for that? I gave him the dignity that I had not given him in the previous year and a half. And after another year with Matt, I basically said, I'm leaving school because of you. And he kind of laughed and said, you're not the first teacher to tell me that. But when I left, it was to get a doctorate in gifted because I needed to know, what do you do when you have a really smart kid? And I knew nothing about gifted at the time. When you have a really smart kid who doesn't do the work, what can we do to help them? And so that's what really brought me into the field in the first place. And the more I studied it, I realized that underachievement was not just with kids like Matt. There were a lot of kids who are kind of afflicted by this. And most of the time, they're not treated, from my perspective, with the dignity they deserve.
That's a great story to really illustrate that, because as teachers, we just say, this is the work, you're expected to do it. I know a lot of times when I'm working with kids who are underachieving, I advocate a lot for, 504 plans or just even different accommodations based on their giftedness. Right. And it's always interesting to me that the teachers will say, well, I can't advance their coursework until they show me that they can do this stuff that we're doing right here.
Exactly.
I get that. I mean, I can see both sides of that. I'm like, but why don't we just give it a shot? Treat this child with the dignity that they deserve, that they're expressing to us, and try to meet them where they are.
And that's what we don't do enough of. And that's why in my book, I distinguish, and we can talk about this more, between two categories of underachievers. Those who do poorly on purpose, and that's really the focus more of my book. And those kids who really do want to do well, but they just feel they're incompetent or not as competent as teachers think they are. And when you read much of the stuff that's out there on underachievement, it's almost like they don't distinguish between these two types of learners, or they create caricatures of kids that I'm just uncomfortable with the way they're portrayed. But the one thing I seldom see in work on underachievement is basically doing what I did with Matt. Listen to the kid, take your cues from him or her, instead of trying to prescribe, we're going to put you on a contract, and if you don't do the work, you're not going to be able to drive your car or use the computer or join a sports team. We take away what they love and force them to do work that they hate and expect it to be a long-term solution? Not so much. It hasn't worked for 50 years. It's not going to start working now.
And in your book, I know that you kind of categorize those learners as as kind of true underachievers and then selective consumers. And I can really relate to that. And one story, this is actually a personal story about me when I was in fifth grade. I was a twice exceptional kid. And back in a day when that wasn't even a thing that people knew about. And, I had a fifth grade teacher who every week on, it was the day that I was gone for my pull-out gifted ed program. Mm-hmm. But the homework that was assigned and then due the next day was to write our spelling words 5 times each. And I was one of the top spellers in my grade. I mean, and so to me, doing that was, I had ADHD. So for me to sit and focus and do that on homework and not even have any class time to do it, it was just not going to happen. Right. And it really became this power struggle between us. And I think that kind of falls under that selective consumer piece. Mm-hmm. How would you kind of differentiate between those two categories of learners? And also, how can educators identify the difference as well?
The kids I highlight in my book are 2 kids I worked with who kind of taught me about this distinction. One is a girl named Sierra, and I taught her when she was in 5th grade, like what you were just talking about. And you look at her test scores, her ability levels. She was a very bright girl, but she felt no matter what she did, it wasn't good enough. I'd give her a paper back, like a test or a quiz or something, and she'd open it up like almost painfully and look at the grade and just kind of close the paper up again. She was terrified of not being able to meet my standards. Anytime she did something that was good and accurate, she would say, I got lucky, or, you just like me, or the test was easy or something. So she externalized everything good about school. It was not because of her. It was because of either other people or luck or whatever. But anything that didn't work out well, if she got a lower grade or a project that didn't turn out the way she wanted, she internalized that failure and called herself dumb. So her self-concept as a learner was quite weak, quite low, and she saw every success as an anomaly, that it's just preventing what's the inevitable, which is going to be my failure or her failure. And that to me is a true underachiever. Sierra needed much more help than there's curricular help, counseling issues, maybe some family involvement, depending on the individual case. But she's the kind of kid who every teacher wants to help, but just doesn't believe that they're competent enough to do the work that you've assigned. Okay? So that is a true underachiever. Now, the selective consumer is the kid who is very teacher dependent. And this was a kid I called him Marty in my book. And Marty was actually a kid I worked with in a counseling capacity and when he was a 6th grader. But he would size up teachers within the first week of school. And he'd basically look you over, ask for something, do great work for the first week of school. And then at the end, he'd say, well, since I already know this work, do you mind if I do X, Y, and Z instead? And if the teacher was compliant and said, that's a great idea, then the life went on very well in that classroom. If the teacher said, Marty, do you know how many kids I teach each day? If I made a difference for you, I'm going to have to change everyone. Marty would just make that teacher's life miserable for the rest of the school year or whatever it was. These are kids who will perform beautifully for teachers who they think are treating them with dignity and respect. And for the others who are just there from their perspective to get a paycheck, they don't care. So if they get an F in a class, it means nothing. Because if they get an A in a class, it means nothing with the teachers they don't like. But they will perform, they'll walk on nails for teachers who are respectful of them, maybe joking with them. They don't need you as a teacher to tell them that they're smart. They know it already. And some teachers think that's their biggest problem. So I don't know if that helps to distinguish between the two types of kids.
With those kids who are those true underachievers, I think the struggle that I face a lot of times is that is just such a long-term process to undo those beliefs that they have about themselves, and to help the parents understand also that it's not just defiance or laziness, or whatever other negative quality that they might associate with that. Here's one of the ways that I think I identify the difference also with when it's a selective consumer. And a lot of times you don't know this until a little bit into the process there. But one year, they're really bad at math. They hate math. They don't want to go to math, they can't do it. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden the next year they're getting a straight A's on all their tests and all their work and everything else. It's like, well, what's the difference there? They like the teacher.
The teacher.
They have a relationship with the teacher.
Yep, exactly right. These kids are relationship-based, where the underachieving kids like Sierra, they really respect you as a teacher just because you're a teacher. They know that you're there to help. They really want to succeed. And in a sense, when they succeed, they feel better for you because, they made you proud rather than feeling proud themselves. And with kids like Marty, it's like, depending on whether or not I think you're worthwhile, I'm going to work or I'm not going to work. So yeah, I totally agree with your distinction there.
And I think we forget that as adults, we have those same feelings about our work. If you have a boss who it's very difficult to feel motivated to do something for somebody that you don't respect or that doesn't treat you with respect and dignity. And why should we expect, just because they're young or they're kids, I don't feel like we should expect anything different from them.
The blowback I get mostly from middle school teachers, and I love middle school teachers. I was one for 17 years. But the blowback I get for kids like Marty is, sometimes when you get a job, you're going to have to do stuff you don't like to do, and you just have to get over it. And that's the excuse they give. So, you got to write your spelling words 5 times, even if you knew them. Well, when you get a job, you're going to have to do stuff that's repetitive too. Well, my response is now, if you're an adult and you have a job like that, the first thing you're going to be doing is looking for a different job and leaving when you can. 5th graders can't just do that. They have to sit there. So the only way they can check out is to do it in a way that just I'm not performing up to your level because it's not worthwhile. And so, when teachers say, well, they're going to have to do that when they're older and, learn how to be bored, I'm like, sorry, school should not be practiced for boredom. If a kid can basically say, here's the work, here's the evidence that I know what I'm doing, what can I do instead? I don't know any reasonable teacher who would say, it's not my job. But sometimes it still happens. Another
thing that I sometimes notice is when gifted kids themselves believe that they're underachievers, even when perhaps they're not. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I was just talking with a client recently, and he's officially in his first year of high school. He's a freshman. However, because he's in an accelerated program for exceptionally gifted kids, he actually is technically a sophomore. He has enough high school credits already, even though he's in his first year of high school, to do this. And he was describing to me, out of his class of about 400 students, he's number 77 in class rank, and how's he ever going to get up to, the top 10? It's like, and he's taking these AP classes. I mean, he's taking junior and senior level courses. Mm-hmm. He can't see that some of those kids who've only had one semester of their freshman year of high school are getting, they have a 4.0 for one semester. So they're above him in class rank, but he can't see that. And it's really damaging his self-esteem. Right. It's interesting to see how that influences him as well.
And I have a similar situation with a girl, a ninth grader, again, that I was working with a couple of years ago. And I walked in class and she was by herself and she was in a corner crying her eyes out. And luckily I didn't go over and say, what's wrong? A stupid thing adults ask. Instead, I said, looks like you're having a bad day. And she put this paper in my face and she says, here's why. And it was an English paper that she'd received back. And she had a grade of 93. And I said, well, tell me about the grade. And she said, it's awful. This is the lowest grade I've ever received. And she's crying her eyes out. And now a typical comment would have been, oh, get over it. 93 is a good grade. For her, it was not. She never until ninth grade had anything less than 100. And so when she gets something that's a chink in the academic armor of 93%, to her, that's a failure. And I think as adults, we have to be sensitive to that because their reality might differ from our reality, but that doesn't mean their reality is wrong. And I think too often we go in, just say, 93 is great, don't worry about it. And that's not addressing the dignity, because for her, that is a bad grade. And we have to realize that and maybe work with her on it. But at the same time, we cannot dismiss that, because that is her reality.
And I think that brings us to the topic of kind of that silver medal syndrome, So, in your book, and you kind of share about this, and there was some research that was done of Olympic athletes in the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona.
Right.
And they researched the facial expressions of silver medalists versus bronze medalists. And so, maybe can you tell us a little bit about that and how that might also apply to our high ability learners?
I can. And actually, there's an update on that because of what just happened at the Winter Olympics. But this was a study done at Cornell University where a professor who's also a photographer decided that he was going to take facial photographs of the people who were winning the medals at the Olympics. So as the medal is being put on over the necks, he took facial photographs. And what he found was the gold medal winners, I don't think he examined them very much. They were just ecstatic because, they're best in the world. But for the silver medalists and the bronze, he found a great distinction. And that is that the bronze medal winners were ecstatic almost to the same level as the gold medal winners. Their facial expressions were just genuinely, I made it. I came in third. I'm getting a medal. The silver medalists, on the other hand, have facial expressions that were fake thank yous. They were not, there's actually a way to analyze smiles. Who knew that? But they analyzed them. They were not genuine smiles. They were, yeah, kind of fine. And so being second in the world at what you do is considered a failure. And if you notice this past couple of weeks, the Canadian women's hockey team came in second, and immediately one of the players, after getting it around her neck, took it off and tossed it to the ground. Second in the world is not good enough. And I think that's the message that a lot of gifted kids receive is that, well, you're so smart. How would you get a B+? You're a smart kid. And you hear that often enough, and you go, then if I can't be number one, why try at all? No matter what I get that's not 100, people are going to say you could have done better. So that's an issue that I deal with a lot with the kids with whom I interact. If I can tell one more story, the kids I work with now, again, they're in ninth grade, but they're actually also in college simultaneously. And there's only 180 kids in our school. So the class sizes are small. I only meet with them one day a month. I don't go over content as much as just life lessons, if you will. And the first day I meet with them, I give them a 10-item checklist, such as this school is going to be so hard, I'll never be able to have any fun, and all that. So there's like 10 items like that. And I ask the kids to read the items and then close their eyes. And then I'm going to repeat each one, and you raise your hand if you're feeling this. Well, the one that gets 70% of the kids on average to raise their hands is I'm going to be the dumbest kid in the smart kids school. So 70% of the hands go up. So we're done with that. I tell them to open their eyes. And I say, statistically, it's impossible for 70% of you to be the dumbest kid. It just doesn't work that way. But it lightens it up. It lightens the mood, because if 3/4 of my classmates are thinking the same thing I am, then maybe I'm not as crazy as I thought. And we have to have those conversations with kids. And the more time we do it, the better it is for them as they go through, whether it's high school, college, or even elementary school. But yeah, I'm very open with kids about talking about topics like this.
Yeah, I think it's important for them to feel that sense of universality with those experiences and emotions, that they're not alone. Mm-hmm. Sometimes just having those opportunities to be with those like-minded peers is so important, even beyond, the academic challenge that it can provide.
Yeah. Let me do one other story. This was, again, I have a lot of conversations with my kids. And I asked them maybe halfway through the year, this was last year, I asked them, will you walk into our building? Do you feel any differently than you when you walked into your middle school last year. And one young lady gave a perfect answer. She said, when I walk into this school, I can exhale. And when you do that, I mean, we can't do it on radio, but when you do that, it makes things better. It makes things right. I belong. I fit. So to walk into a place and just go, if that's what school could be like, we're doing a good job. And I thought that I've actually titled one of my presentations, Learning to Exhale, because a lot of times these kids don't know how to do that because they're so built up with the anxiety to do well.
The theme of your book, as you talk about this, reversing underachievement through this lens, of dignity, is getting to A. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what that philosophy means and kind of how we can conceptualize that?
Yeah, I put it for getting to A, and not meaning the letter grade of A. If that comes, that's great. But I focus my book around a number of different concepts, if you will, that all begin with the letter A. And the first one, that's autonomy, which is how we can help our kids, our students, engage and become masters of their own universe with respect to education and what it might become for them. We basically have a prescribed curriculum, and for many kids that fits. But for those for whom it doesn't, what autonomy can we give those students who are ready to go beyond and ready to do something more? What tools do they have within themselves that can bring to light more of what they know or need to know? Okay, so that's autonomy. Also access. How do we work with students to identify curricular challenges that are meaningful and interesting to them? If you are a fifth grader capable of eighth grade work, can you have that content in one way or other? Either go to the eighth grade class or get some material that's more complex than the material you're supposed to learn that you learned 3 years ago. So having access to places that and people that you might not generally get because of your age, because school is still so age-based, as you know, it's very unusual. Even with our kids who, they start taking college classes in ninth grade. We had one boy who has skipped 2 grades already. So he's 12 years old and he's taking, intro to psychology at the college level. But he needs the access to that because he already knows so much other stuff that we would have taught him in ninth grade. The next is one, I think it's one of the most important, and it's advocacy. I want students to be able to advocate for their own educations and empower them to become their own best spokespeople. We don't do that oftentimes. We don't let kids lead us down the path that they need to go down. And my early story of Matt with his maple sugar farming is just one way to, a good colleague of mine named Deb Douglas from Wisconsin just put out a book called The Power of Self-Advocacy, which is a great book. And what it does is it teaches kids how to, middle school and above, how to be your own best advocate in school. How do you approach a teacher in a respectful, honest, professional way to get changes that will benefit you? Her book is great. Her suggestions for advocacy are great. But I think too many times our kids are either intimidated to approach an adult and ask for something different, or they come in like, battering rams, and we don't want to listen to them. Or they say, I hate school, it's boring. Well, as a teacher, you know what? I'm not going to listen to that because I don't wake up every morning figuring out ways to bore you as a student. So you have to teach kids ways to be their own best advocates. And again, Deb's book, and I hope mine to some degree does that. Alternatives is one of the other A's. A lot of kids just don't fit, especially in high school. Sometimes high school is not a good fit for particular kids. Now, with homeschooling options, independent study, online coursework, we have so many more options than we had even 10 years ago that I want kids to be able to explore those and not to see it as a defeat of high school, but just a different way to go. But I don't want people to see that alternative as lesser than a typical high school experience. They're both valuable for different kids for different reasons. And the last 2 A's is one of them is aspirations. How can we respect our kids' dreams and help them to achieve their personal goals? I have example after example of how you could do that to have the kids reach higher than they ever thought they could. And sometimes this comes about with projects that are not school-based, but could be. One of my favorites is a young man from Ohio who his sister was selling candles for a school project. And the candles smelled like roses and strawberries and stuff. And this brother smelled the candles. He said, no dude is ever going to buy these candles. They smell too girly and feminine. So he started with $100 of his own money and a $200 loan from his parents. He started a company called Man Cans, which is candles that smell like firewood and bacon and pizza and stuff like that. And they're sold in soup cans. And He started this in 2011 when he was 13 years old. He got a full-page spread in Entrepreneur magazine, and now he's just starting college in majoring in economics, but he's sold over 300,000 man cans, and for every one he sells, he gives a meal to a homeless shelter in one of 4 states. I mean, but this has never been part of his schooling, you know? He had to actually give it up because he said, my schoolwork was too intense. Why even we meshed the two? No, it's not that hard. And the last A is approachable educators, which is probably the most valuable one, especially for these selective consumers. Because once they find a teacher who gets it, they just don't give up on these people. And they just want to go back year after year, even if you're not their teacher anymore, just to check in. And so if you can have that attitude of, you know, I might be a teacher, but I don't know everything. And just because you're a student doesn't mean you don't know anything. If you have that kind of attitude by a teacher, life will be good.
So autonomy, access, advocacy, alternatives, aspirations, and approachable educators.
Yes, there's a quiz later. Yes.
Yes. So, you know, one of the things that I hear a lot of times when I'm doing trainings with teachers or I'm talking to parents at the office is that they become very concerned about making accommodations for high ability kids. And you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. They're worried that it will lead them to either a sense of entitlement or a learned helplessness. So what would you tell those critics or those people who have those concerns to assure them that this is actually going to be in the best interest of the student?
I would take one of 2 tacts. One is that, again, my background is special ed for kids with disabilities. There's not a person I met when I was doing that as my career that looked at me and said, why are you giving these kids special treatment? Just treat them like everyone else. Because we realize that if it takes you twice as long to learn something, or you have dyslexia and you just takes longer to read and decipher, that we're going to find ways to help you. And it's not going to make you feel entitled or exploited. It's basically because these are your needs, and this is what we think, or these are the ways we think we can best help you. For some reason, that logic doesn't transfer to gifted kids. And I never understood that, because if you have an IQ of 50, obviously your educational needs are going to differ substantially from a kid who has an average IQ of 100. Why don't we understand that if a kid has an IQ of 150, that even though their needs are going to be different, they're still going to deviate as much from the typical as you'd get for a kid with a 50 IQ. So I don't understand how logical people don't see this as logical, that, you know, we help the kids at both ends, not just the ones in the middle. And the other example I use, if they don't like that approach, is I take a look at all of the things we do in schools extracurricularly. We have, when we have sports teams, for example, we have intramural squads, maybe club groups, junior varsity, and varsity. That's a very respectful thing to do, because for the kids at the absolutely highest levels of ability in football or whatever, we want to have a place where they can interact with other kids like themselves in terms of their abilities, their talents, their drive, and all that. And then you have kids who just kind of want to mess around. They're never going to be NFL stars, and they don't want to be. So we have provisions for them as well. We don't do that with academics at all. You know, it's like all or nothing. And I really think we need to see this range. Yes, football players, you know, there's the starting quarterback. And if you're in the orchestra, there's a first chair. And if you're in a class play, there's a lead. And then the other kids who play the trees. Yeah. But when we have gifted kids, we don't think that we have to do anything for the highest ability level. I think it's just naive and just plain dumb that we don't see the logic of providing that. But it's a constant struggle. I've been doing this 40 years, and it's the same arguments I'm making now I made 40 years ago.
Seems like, it's just on repeat. Mm-hmm. For parents and educators who are maybe wanting to get started with this and see the kids that maybe can benefit from some of these tools, you know, what would you say is the best place for them to start, helping those kids feel that dignity and also to reverse that underachievement?
The one thing I'll say, and this came out at a session I did on this topic maybe a year ago, and there was a school administrator, a principal in the audience, who had a 17-year-old son who was on the verge of dropping out of high school in his senior year. She was just convinced that that would be the worst thing he could do. She was taking away every privilege that he had at school and at home, because she was going to demand that he get this done. And I asked how it's going, and she said, terrible. What kind of unexpected. And I said, I hate to put you on the spot, you know, in a public setting. So that's a question you mean I want to answer. But are you willing to give up the relationship with your son for the sake of a grade? And she didn't have an answer right away. But I think that's where we need to focus, is especially with these kids, not like the Sierras, but more like the Martys, who are the selective consumers. The dignity that they want, the dignity that they need, is not expressed by punishing them for not doing something the way they're supposed to do it. We've tried that for 50 years. It doesn't work. And I just think that the relationship piece is so strong with these kids that as a dad myself, I never wanted to give up the relationship I had with my son and say, yeah, we don't talk anymore, but at least he got an A. And I think if parents just take a step back, remember that kid is the little kid who wanted to do well, and now the big kid who does, but maybe in a different fashion, that really is the place to begin. There's all kinds of strategies but it really begins with the relationship between mom, dad, and the kid. And same thing with teachers, but to a greater degree at home.
Dr. Jim Delisle, thank you so much for being on the show today, and we appreciate all of your expertise and feedback.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
This is from a young lady who I knew I taught her when she was in middle school. Stephanie likes to work by herself, and this will give you an indication of why. I know it's very hard to read, but what she says is profound. She said, a negative about being gifted is you might not have as good an imagination, since you know things are or aren't true that other kids do. A negative about that is you might not believe stories that would be fun to believe, but a positive is you can still pretend you believe them and have fun. And of all the kids I think I've ever taught, my 40 years of teaching, I don't think I ever met anyone who socially got along with so many kids, because Stephanie would start with her vocabulary way up here, and if you understood it, she stayed there. And if you didn't, she just gradually brought it down to your level. So she would start with Neanderthal, and if kids didn't get it, she'd say caveman. I asked her about it. And I said, I've seen you do this a number of times. And she looked at me like, well, duh, because she said, when you talk to somebody, of course you want to be understood. She was in the back of the room, and this girl was just drawing her heart out. And the teacher went up to her and said, what are you drawing? And she said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher looked at her and said, honey, nobody knows what God looks like. She says, well, they will in a minute. My favorite story about Joanne, because Joanne ended up being the dean of my college where I was a professor. So we got to know each other very well. And she talked about this one young kid named Tommy. And she taught him in 1st through 3rd grade, and he was just tough to deal with. But he succeeded very well in those 3 years. And so when she interviewed him in the 4th grade, her question was, do you remember what you were like as a 6-year-old? And Tommy's answer was this: when I remember myself when I was 6, my eyes get wet. If a kid notices that, you know something is right. So the secret is I dedicated my new book to Joanne. I still teach gifted high school kids 1 day a month. And I always like to say the best way to teach 9th graders is 1 day a month. And so I do that, and that feeds my soul. My wife and I just had a new book come out called Creating Strong Kids Through Writing. And we are both adamant that you can get kids socially and emotionally much more aware than they are through writing activities that aren't the dull 5-paragraph essays that kids are sometimes required to write. So even though I'm retired, I'm not really, I'm still working with kids, writing books, traveling to Kuala Lumpur to speak and all that kind of stuff. But it's the kids that keep me going. If I go back every month and just have that 1 day with those 9th graders, it stirs my soul. It's a good thing.
I'm Emily Kircher Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.